Niat Robert, Yankaping Kawacha, Yaiswang, Yankaping Kawacha Yap, Ikure Clemson. So I said that my name is Robert, and I teach for the people of the river, which is what the Catawba call themselves. But my full-time job is with Clemson Extension, and I do forestry and wildlife, and I cover a part of the state of South Carolina. So I'm going to talk to you about plants and animals and how the Catawba kind of related to all that. And I may or may not even use my presentation. I don't know where I'm headed with this really. But to start with, I want all of you to use your imagination. If you want to, you can close your eyes. Some people think that's weird to close your eyes in a public place like this. But just imagine you're an early settler and you're wandering across the United States. And you come upon this place where there's rolling hills and it's covered with grass. And there's scattered trees all over the place. And you see buffalo, herds of buffalo. They have hides on their body. And they're disguising themselves as deer. And they're slowly sneaking up on the bison, on the buffalo, and they have their bow and arrow. Okay, now, who can tell me what part of the country I just described? What do you think?
The Piedmont.
You got that right. Most people say the prairie. But a long time ago, from the earliest explorers, they would mention how open the Piedmont was. And the best descriptions are with John Lawson, because he went for 25 miles through York County and Mecklenburg County and never left a prairie. And so the world was much different. It was open, it was grassy, you had bison and elk running everywhere. The plant life, plant diversity, it's hard to imagine how much was there because most plants need sunlight. You know, people think when they see a nice shady forest that, you know, that's just pristine and there's a lot of diversity there. Not really, not really. Unless you have the Smokies, but that's diverse for other reasons. But when you don't have the sunlight getting to the forest floor, you don't have all these plants. And you don't have as many wild animals. The turkey and bison and elk and deer were just so abundant when John Lawson came through this area. And the reason for that is the Native Americans, they watched what happened when the light didn't hit the ground. And they saw the fire go across the landscape and noticed how that influenced the landscape. So then they started to use those same tools to manipulate the landscape to benefit themselves, but it also benefit the plants and animals. So it's a reciprocal relationship there because the native peoples benefited from this fire and from the plants and animals were there, but also the plants and animals benefited from the native people. So it's a much different world view than we have now. Heard one person say one time that for the Catawba, the outside was their inside because it was all the same to them. You know, for us, it's two different worlds. And we even think of animals as, you know, they're over there, they're different than us. And they are, but they also have a lot in common. And the native peoples didn't see it that way. They saw the plants and animals as being like their relationships. So it's their plant relationships and their animal relationships. And part of that goes back to this idea that humans, plants, and animals were all created by Withriwe, which is one who never dies, which is what the Catawba call God. So in that way, you're all related and all dependent upon each other. So just a much different worldview. So they did manage their ecosystems, but they did it differently than we do now. It was less of an idea of human dominance and more of an idea of working with plants and animals and with nature to achieve what they needed. And then down along the rivers, I mean, they cleared the rivers, the riverbanks, because that's where they were growing their crops. I mean, they would go out there and they would strip the bark off the tree, and they would cut down all the saplings that were around and piled up around that tree and set it on fire to kill the roots. And then later on, they may come back and cut down the tree, or they may not. Pretty hard to cut it down with stone tools. But they could use fire to help with that, because after they chopped on it for a while, they could set it on fire and let it burn through. So they cleared all these areas and they were farming. You know, the corn and beans and squash you all think of. You know, there are so many foods that you eat today that you are from Native Americans. We don't realize it. You know, you'd never have a tomato weren't for the Native Americans taking that out of the forest in South America and turning it into what we have now by breeding. They were doing genetic breeding before anybody in Europe was. Because, you know, corn started off as like this little grass. You can still find it in Mexico. Got a tiny little seed head. And it was bred by Native Americans into the corn that we have now. So it was just a different worldview. And a lot of that is expressed in their stories. And I'm going to tell you some stories. One is where Ingpi came from. Ingpi is fire. So I don't know if anybody have ever noticed this before, but sometimes on really cold mornings, if you pass Inse, I believe it's Inse, Insine, vultures, they have their wings out. Before they fly, they're trying to warm up. So there's a story about where fire came from. And in this story, the vultures were all standing around the fire, warming themselves up. And they weren't sharing the fire with anyone else. But Dabawang, which is Catawba for rabbit, Dabawang is cold, so he goes up and he's just begging. He's going to the different vultures there. Please, 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 can I have some fire? My feet are so cold. My feet are so cold. And they kept saying no. And then he finally found a generous vulture that said, okay, you can stick your foot in and warm that up. That's it, though. So Dabawang did, but Dabawang had been thinking about this, and he stuck some wood splinters in between his toes and put it in there and set it on fire. And then he goes jumping through the forest, and the fire spread, and that's how we all got fire. Okay, so that's one version of the story. There's another version that tells us something about the Catawba landscape. Because in this version, when Dabawang puts his foot in there and sets the splinters on fire and goes jumping back, it says he goes through the prairie. And that's because there was prairie here. And they would personify animals, and that's part of showing how they are related or feel that relationship to the animals. And they would use those stories to teach. Another great one that they would use to teach their children was where water came from. Water is Yaye. And a long, long time ago, Kayak, which is a turtle, Kayak had all the Yaye in the world underneath his shell. And just sat there and guarded it. Wouldn't share it with the people, with any of the animals. So Dabawang, a lot of their stories have the rabbit or the possum, ironically, as a trickster. So Dabawang goes up to Kayak, the turtle, and starts begging for water. Please, 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 can I have some Yaye? But Kayak says no. So he goes away all upset. Then he finds his person or animal who's usually his enemy, the fox. Depingamuyang is fox. And they come up with a plan. So they go back to Kayak. And Dabawang goes around to the front and starts talking to Kayak, just begging for Yaye for water. In the meantime, the fox was behind it, digging at the bottom of its shell. And he just keeps digging and digging until all the water comes gushing out. And that's how people and animals got water. So they would use this to teach lessons, really great lessons. So What is a lesson you think you can learn from that story? Share. Yeah, it's important to share because Kayak was being kind of selfish. And still today, if you see a turtle walking along, what are they doing with their head? Are they looking up most of the time? They're looking down. They're ashamed of themselves. So you could take that and teach your children not to be selfish because you're always seeing Kayak walking around with his head down. Any other lessons you can learn from that story? What about the rabbit and the fox? Work together because they're not friends, but they work together and they got something done. So there are important lessons in these stories. So the stories are more than just stories. I mean, they're entertainment. They help to explain the world. Where did water come from? Where did fire come from? But they also are great for teaching lessons. So the elders would teach this to their children. And when they would go out to plant their crops, the men helped with planting the crops typically. The women and the children would do most of the tending of the crops afterwards, but the men would help with planting. And they would have a leader go out there who would tell stories while they were planting. And he would sing songs where they were planting. So that was all part of passing on that culture. And as what Inslee mentioned, every time smallpox came through, half the tribe would die. So it would be the elders who were the teachers, and the young who were the learners. So because of that, through time, the Catawba have lost so much. I mean, I'm working on the manuscript on their plants that they use, and I've got 160, but I know it was more than that. And I'm going to talk about some of the plants and what they were used for. And if you have any questions, you can ask me about that. I'm going to use my glasses. If I do it now, I can't see you. But if I put on my Dollar General glasses now, I can see. Because I wrote down notes. These are all plants I found just walking around right here. Yeah, Eastern red cedar, which actually is not a cedar. It's a juniper. But when explorers came here and discovered, even though people had already known about it for thousands of years, discovered the Eastern red cedar, they're like, oh, it looks like the cedar we have back home. So they called it the cedar. But the Catawba used that to make their spoons and their bowls and stuff like that. So they would get the wood and they would carve it out. And I'm sure they used it for other uses, but we just don't have that anymore. The little cone on it, it looks like a berry, but it's actually the little blue cone. If you taste it, it tastes like gin because gin comes from junipers. What else? Oh, pine trees. So there's shortleaf pine out here. So that would grow on the reservation. And a lot of their territory also went to the coast. So longleaf pine, they would use that. But they would take the resin, or actually the rosin, then we get the part that was already dried up, and they could put a little bit in their mouth if their stomach was upset. It would soothe it. You don't want to put too much, just a little bit. It's going to taste terrible, but that would soothe their stomach. They also would take the wood and make it into splinters and use those for blowgun darts. And if you come to the festival in November, then Cassidy, who's going to speak next, her father will be there with his blowgun. So you can see it demonstrated. It's really, really cool. But they also made pine needle baskets. So they would use longleaf pine for that because the needles get to be about this long. And the baskets are really gorgeous. And they still make them on the reservation. When I'm at the cultural center working, yeah, there's one right here. When I'm working at the cultural center, they're just sitting around making the baskets. It's really awesome. There's black walnut out here. And has anybody ever picked up one of the fruit and held it in your hand and see what color your hand is afterwards? Yeah, they used it for dye. So the husk is really important for dye. They could also use the leaves. And depending on how you processed the leaves and the husk, you could get brown or you could get yellows or something in between. And they would also take the husk and they would drop it into pools of water along the Catawba River that were kind of where the water was kind of slow. So it's kind of a pool. And they drop it in there, and they call it stupefying, but it's sucking the oxygen out of the water, and then the fish pass out and float to the top, and you can go in there and pick them up. And they would make nets. They would have nets. They could pick them up with that because they used some of the fibers of trees, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, to make nets. They also used spears. They had spears that they made from river cane. I'm going to talk about river cane a good bit at the end. There's none growing here, but it's super important for native cultures. And now it's declined so much that they're having trouble finding river cane to practice their culture. White oak is out here, and white oaks are really important. They made baskets from the wood, because you take it and you split it in these really thin slivers, and then you can weave it into baskets. And I'm not Catawba, but I worked on the reservation. I grew up in Rock Hill, so I've always been around it. And I would help them process the wood. I really like doing that. But when it gets time to make the basket, I'm still a scientist and not artsy, so I let them do that part. But you could take the bark. Red oak bark is better, but you could take the white oak bark and you could boil it in water, and it turns the water kind of a dark color, and that's the tannins in the bark. Then you could use that on any kind of skin infection or poison ivy or any kind of boils or ulcers on your skin. You could use that because I can't remember the name of it, right word for it now, but it's sucking the moisture out. So it helps you heal with that. And the acorns are important. Y'all may say acorns, but I've still got the Appalachia in my accent, so I call them acorns. But they would take those, they would pick them up, and you crack them open, and then you could either grind them first, or you could take them whole and you soak it in water. And it turns the water brown. That's the tannins. You got to pour that off. Usually you want to soak them again, and then pour that off. And then if you haven't ground them already, you could grind them, and then you would pull it in boiling water, and all the oils that are in there are going to float to the top, because all nuts, and acorns are actually, there's nuts. The oil floats to the top, and they would collect that to use as butter. So their butter came from either hickory nuts or from oak acorns. And then they could take that flour and use it to make bread. Oftentimes they could use that flour just alone for bread, or they could mix it into their cornbread because it has protein. Because cornbread was a big staple. It's amazing the things that they did with cornbread, or with corn in general. One thing about corn, there's corn and then there's hominy. The Native Americans figured out hominy, because if you eat corn, just straight corn, because of the outer skin, a lot of the nutrients are hard to get to. So like during the Depression, a lot of people in the South just ate corn and they got sick because of vitamin deficiencies. The Native Americans had figured out you got to get that skin off. So they would cook it with white oak ash, and that would make the skin come off. So you take the skin off, and then you clean it with water, and you have hominy. And it was much more nutritious. So that's primarily what the Native Americans ate, was hominy. It was not, we eat it off the corn on the cob straight. They weren't doing that because there wasn't as much nutrition.
Did they make it into grits?
They did. Yeah, we got grits from Native Americans. Yeah. They call it corn mush, but yeah, it was grits. And we still make it on the reservation occasionally. We taught a class this summer for the kids, and somehow I ended up being in charge of cooking. I don't know, but we made traditional dishes. We also made, I didn't see any hickory out here, but hickory is kind of neat. They would collect the nuts, which are super hard to crack. So they would pound them and crack them, and they would process it with the shell because it just wasn't worth the trouble. It just wasn't worth it. But they could sift it. They made sifters out of river cane, and they could sift it and separate the shell from the nut. and then they would boil that. It made lots and lots of fat that floated on the top, and that would be their hickory butter. Or you could leave it in there, and it makes a really, really rich hickory nut soup. But you can't eat much because there's so much fat in it. I mean, it's really good, but got to limit what you eat. There's sugarberry out here, which is a hackberry, and they ate the fruit, and it is kind of sweet. They're really small. You have to collect a lot of them, but oftentimes they would collect the fruit, and then they would put it in the cornbread. Persimmons would go in the cornbread. So they did a lot of that. A spice bush is out here. Growing along the edges here, this spice bush. And it has if you break the leaves, it's starting to lose it now because they're about to drop their leaves. But if you break a twig and sniff it, it has this really, really spicy odor. So they would take the twigs and steep them in water to make a tea. And I think there's some in here. I know that one of the vases has some sweet shrub in it. Oh, and we got pawpaw out here. That was a really, really popular food for them, collecting the pawpaws. You've got to beat the animals to it first, though, because they're really sweet. They're almost like a banana or custard, really sweet. Some years they're good years, some years are bad years. I've seen a few this year, not too many, but you have to take the skin off. Cannot eat the skin because it'll make you sick. Some people even break out from touching it. But they would take that and they would eat it. And then they could take the bark and use it for cordage to make ropes, twine, thread, and stuff like that. And you have to peel it off. And usually they use the smaller, not the big trees, but the smaller ones. They would take those, you could dry the bark some, then you pound it and it splits into fibers. And then you could take that and you weave it into thread and rope. So it was used for that. There's yellow poplar out here, which actually is not a poplar. It's a magnolia, but they called it poplar because the petiole, which is the stem of the leaf, is flat. So that means when the wind blows, it shakes, just like quake and aspen and the cottonwood that lives here. So they thought, oh, it's got to be a poplar, but it's not. Anyway, the Catawba would strip the bark off that and use it for their bark homes. And they can be massive. In the Smokies, I've seen them like this big around. And they would cut them down, and that's what they would use for their canoes. And it would take them 3 months with stone tools to carve it out. But they also use fire, because they would carve a little bit, then they would set it on fire and let it burn, and then they would carve that out. In any place where they didn't want it to burn, they put clay. So that kept that part from burning. Let's see. Oh, pokeweed is out here, or poke salad, is what some people call it. And the Catawba ate that. I mean, that's where Southerners got that idea of it, to eat it. But, you have to pick them young, boil them, pour the water off, boil them again. I would pour it off again because it's toxic. So you got to get rid of the toxins, and then you got some good food. Love it. I mean, same thing with potatoes. I mean, they're toxic. You can't eat them until you cook them. And then you can eat them because they're in the deadly nightshade family. But you could take the fruit of the pokeberry, and you could process that to make a dye. It didn't hold real well, but it would work good with clothing and stuff like that. And their clothing was more than leather. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Oh, it's the next thing on the list. All right, so there's red mulberry out here. Okay, there's also, I think, a little bit of white mulberry, which is imported. That was brought in so we could have a silk trade, but it didn't work. And now it's kind of escaped. But I did find some red mulberry over here, which is our native one. And the fruit is awesome. Anybody ever had mulberry before? Well, not many people. You are missing out. You got to get out there in June, though, and get out there fast before the birds, because they love it. But it's really great. But they would take the inner bark. They would find small trees or root sprouts, which is where a tree just sprouts up from a root. And they would get those when they were really small, and they could peel the bark off and dry it some and pound it, make these really, really fine fibers. And they would use that to weave. There's drawings of Native Americans. They have a loom basically, and they're weaving clothing. So when DeSoto came through South Carolina in 1540, went to Cofeta, which Cassidy will probably mention Cofeta. It was near Camden. It was the big mound city. These people were wearing, looked like cotton clothing, but it wasn't cotton, it was mulberry. That was really amazing. So they used a lot of plants for their clothing. And the Catawba used a lot of possum hair. You wouldn't think so, but they made a lot of their clothing using possum hair. Oh, and there's elm out here. There's a winged elm over here. And elms were important also for fibers because the inner bark is really great. It's real stringy. So they would process that to make fibers for rope or what thread. But they would also just strip the bark off and use it to make baskets. You just fold it up and sew the sides together, and you got a basket. Okay, I saw a really big muscadine out here. Of course, everybody thinks of course, they're going to eat that, and they are. And they would collect the grapes, and there's other wild grapes in the South besides muscadine, but they would collect the grapes, and then they would put them over a fire in the smoke, and they call it sweating. What they were doing is just driving out some of the water. And then they would take those and put them in the sun, let them finish drying out, and they would store them for the winter. They could put it in their cornbread, anything like that. And there is a grape called a Catawba grape. Nothing to do with the tribe, though. What it is, I believe it's the fox grape, which grows all over the Piedmont, was crossed with the European grape for wine, and they call it Catawba grape. But actually, it had nothing to do with the tribe. Okay, and then there's river cane. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this because some people call this the plastic of Native Americans because they did so much with it. And there's none growing out here. And it's really uncommon to find it now, especially large stands of it. It's been reduced by 98%. In fact, the Bachman's warbler, which only nested in it, is now extinct because it didn't have a place to live anymore. And a lot of tribes are having difficulties with this because they can't use it to make their baskets. So they're searching all over and they're trying to begin to manage for it. But it was everywhere when Lawson came through the South, came through the Carolinas. It was very common, growing along the rivers. Part of that was because the Catawba had cleared a lot of places, and they would rotate. They would farm an area for a few years, and then would rotate to another area so the soil could recover. And while it was recovering, all the rhizomes, which is basically a stem underground of the river cane that was there, it sprouted up. So that helped the river cane. That goes back to that reciprocal relationship I talked about earlier, where the Catawba helped the plants, but the plants are also helping the Catawba. So that helped the river cane. Fire helped the river cane because it cleared out areas. It's ironic, it grows near rivers, but it burns really well. And then flooding. Flooding was really important because when rivers have their normal flood pattern, then the waters get up on the floodplain and they kind of gouge out areas, and then that's a place where river cane can get started because it needs full sunlight. We dam their rivers so we don't get the normal cycle that they need. So for all of these reasons, river cane is just not very common anymore. But it was used for baskets, of course. It was used for mats, make beautiful mats, and those were used either to sleep on. Sometimes they would put them on the wall for decoration. Sometimes they would wrap their dead in it when they buried them. They would use it for wattle and daub walls, which is where they would take river cane and use that for kind of the structure of a wall, because they lived in bark houses, but they also had big buildings where the whole tribe could meet. And they had walls and then a thatched roof made out of plants. So they would, for the wall, they would weave together this some of the river cane, and then they would put mud on it, clay. So it was basically like putting bricks on there. So they used it for that. Used it for spears. They used it for enemas. Get this. They're the only tribe in the east that used enemas. And they would get really small river cane, and they would put clay on one end and then kind of fire that so it got hard. On the other end, they would take eel skin, eel out of the river, and then they would use that as the bubble. And that's how they would deliver medicine. So it was really kind of ingenious. So it was used for that. So it just had so many uses. Um, anything else I wanted to say? And yeah.
And I just wanted to let you know, we do have some river cane.
Oh, do you?
I
Good.
will show it to you later. It's down near the wetlands.
Okay.
And there's actually a movement here in our area for replanting of river cane. So we are going to be exploring that as well. So we're trying to bring it back. So a lot of people unfortunately rip it out because they think it's it's not maybe attractive or whatever, or they mix it up with bamboo.
Yeah.
But it is or if you have land and you don't know if it's bamboo or river cane, you can speak to that a little bit maybe. But it generally never grows more than 1 inch in diameter, is one thing I've been told. So if you want to help people recognize it so they don't get rid of it, that would be great.
When bamboo, when it puts out its branches, the branches come straight out from the stem. But with river cane, what happens, I don't know how I'm going to demonstrate this with my arm, but the stem will grow up the stem, a branch will grow up the stem just a short ways, and then it branches out. And that's the easiest way to tell them apart. Because river cane can get to 30 feet tall. I mean, it was so big with early explorers came through here that you said they could put like a pint of whiskey in it in one of the sections. So it can get big. You normally don't see that anymore. The branching pattern is the best way to tell the difference. Yeah, the eel, I'm going to get you out. I'm going to talk about animals for a minute. Eel and shad were really important for the Catawba, but they don't get them anymore. They can't come upriver because there's too many dams. Yeah. Well, there's black cherry out here. I noticed that. And they made a cough syrup out of that. There's black cherry and a couple of other plants that they would combine for cough syrup. For women troubles, there was a lot of things for women troubles. They would, one of the things, they would take sourwood, take the leaves, take them raw, and put them in cold water and leave them there until the water started to turn yellow-green, and then you would drink that. Tastes terrible from what my friends tell me, but it works. Yeah. They also would use the sourwood for their arrows because these young branches are pretty straight. So they use it for the arrows, or they use river cane for their arrows also. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What about sassafras? Is that part of the culture?
Yes, they could use it as a drink. But also when John Lawson came through here, one of his people with him had an injury on his leg. And they got some sassafras and they made a poultice. That's where you take leaves and you pound them where it releases the liquids. It ends up just being a pile of mush. And then they took teeth of a garfish and scraped it. That was real important because you're scraping it so the medicine can get in there. And then they put the poultice on there and it healed the leg.
Oh, you scrape the wound?
Yes, scrape the wound, yes. Well, this really wasn't a wound. It was more of a swollen area, like he had got a really bad bruise or something.
Yeah, it's a wound when you got that.
Yeah, well, they didn't scrape that hard. And see, they would use the gar teeth. If you visited and they really liked you when you were leaving, they would scratch your shoulder with it. And that was a sign of friendship. And they trusted you.
Yes, could you address the relationship of the Catawba people with the Catawba tree?
Oh, that's a great one. Relationship between Catawba tree and Catawba people. And historically, Catawba trees didn't grow here. They grew farther west. Uh, they think that the name comes from, actually, they think that the name Catawba, because they didn't call themselves Catawba. They called themselves Yeaswang or Eastwang, people of the river. But the Choctaw, they think that's where it came from because they used the word Catawba, I believe it's Choctaw, for flatheads. Because the Waxhaw, which was a town, a Native American town close to Rock Hill, in that town they actually flattened their heads. Yeah, so when the babies were young, they would take a bag of sand or something and put it on their forehead to flatten their head. So because of that, all of the members of the Catawba Confederacy, and the Confederacy was all joined by language and culture, they called all of them flatheads. So when you look at the flower of, again, complicated here, but when you look at the flower of a Catawba tree, there's a place in there where it's flattened. So that's what Catawba means, is it's a flattened part of the flower. So that got corrupted into Catawba. And they used it to describe the Catawba because the Waxhaw flattened their heads. That's the theory.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, once again, Dr. Carter is the Catawba Nation Outdoor Education Specialist.